So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case. Today is part 3 of the Beauty Queen killer case. So if you haven't caught part 1 and 2, where have you been? I'll link them both up here in the eye. You definitely need to watch part 1 and 2 before you can watch this one, otherwise it won't make any sense at all. I'll wait for you. You can go and watch those on another tab and then come right back here and I'll tell you the rest of the case. But quickly, before we get into the video, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to let you know that this video is sponsored by me. Kind of, not really. I just wanted to let you know that I'm posting on my second channel again. I'm uploading on there every single week, so if you want to know what you can expect from the second channel, we've put together a little bit of a trailer. We at the hotel, motel, holiday Inn. I'll see you when I've got a cocktail in my hand. You ready? Transition this, bitch. Whoa. So this is my Edinburgh OOTD. Dress is from ASOS. Flared pants, also from ASOS. This is my bed jumping OOTD. We got this like squid thing and we thought it was going to be like calamari, and this is how it showed up.
It's genuine rubber.
Yes, hello Prime Minister Boris. It's Nicki Minaj.
The beach room. Oh my god. Right, no, straight away. Sorry, who are you? Are you on the guest list?
It's our mate bag.
Oh, wow. This is the space themed room. Look how cute they are. I booked myself in for lip injections. I don't know why. I look like handsome Squidward. Oh my god, I'm bruised. Over the last few months, I've been filming all different kinds of content, and editor Jake has been working overtime to make it the most cursed content you're ever gonna see. I'm just loving creating content over there so much, and if you want to see more of me, more of Eleanor, the girl behind the really serious true crime videos, then that's where to find her. I'll link my second channel down below in the description. I'll also leave a little link up in the eye up here if you want to go and subscribe. I would love to have you over there. It's just like one big party. So yeah, thanks again to me for sponsoring my video. Now let's get into it. Now before we get into it, I do just want to give the same content warnings that I gave in parts 1 and 2. This is a very intense case, especially part 3. Part 3 literally feels like it's never ending. It's one thing after another and it can get super intense. The specific themes involve rape and sexual assault, torture, and a lot of the victims are young women, specifically teenagers. Some of them are children as well. So if any of that is something that you don't feel like you can watch right now, I completely understand. Please click out of the video and look after yourself. That is the most important thing. I'm sure I can see you again some other time with a different case that's maybe a little bit more suitable for you. So I'm going to give you a quick little summary of the case so far, and then we'll just flow right into part 3. So it's March of 1984 in Miami, Florida, and 2 beautiful young women have disappeared without a trace. Their names are Rosario Gonzalez and Elizabeth Kenyon. Both girls didn't know each other. They have absolutely no links between each other apart from this one man. 39-year-old Christopher Wilder. In parts 1 and 2, we looked at Christopher Wilder's childhood and his teenage years into his young adulthood, and that man was a monster. He was a rapist by the age of like 15. He's also been accused of being responsible for an infamous unsolved double murder in Sydney, Australia, known as the Wanda Beach murders. They were the murders of 2 15-year-old girls. But now he is back in America, and it seems he is on a spree of absolute terror. Where we left off in part 2, Christopher Wilder had just abducted 19-year-old Linda Grober from a shopping mall. And he did this using his usual MO. He did this same thing every single time he wanted to abduct a victim. He would pretend that he was a fashion photographer and that he was doing this photo shoot for a big magazine. He would go up to these young girls and say, "You're perfect for this. You have the look. Please will you be in this photo shoot?" And these girls would be so excited that they would just say yes. They wouldn't actually take the time to think how weird this situation was, that this random man wanted to take photos of them. These girls would just do it. And these photo shoots almost always ended up with Christopher Wilder sexually assaulting, raping, or even abducting and torturing these young women. And it was about to get even worse. And his next victim came the very next day after he abducted and lost Linda Grober. By now, he'd actually crossed over into Texas and he was looking for another young woman to take. And that was when he spotted 23-year-old Terry Walden, a nursing student from Beaumont, Texas. Terry was happily married at the time. Although she was very young, she actually had 2 children, and her and her husband and her kids were so happy. She was so excited to have this little family unit. But on March 23rd, 1984, Terry Walden failed to pick her children up from daycare. And this was nothing like her. She was the most devoted mother anyone had ever met. And so straight away, her husband knew that something was wrong and he reported her missing. Luckily, Terry had told her husband that morning where she was going to be, that she was going to go to the mall and pick up some bits. And so he told the police where they could try and search for her. They went down to this mall and they couldn't find Terry anywhere. Or her car. Rumours began circulating around the town where Terry lived that maybe she'd run away. People were gossiping, saying that maybe she didn't love her husband anymore, maybe she was cheating, maybe the family life just wasn't what she wanted and so she ran away to start a new life. But after the police spoke with the people that knew Terry the best, like her husband and all of her family members, they realised that that just was not her character at all. She adored her children. She adored her husband. She loved her life. She was never going to just run away and start over again by herself. That just wasn't even an option. And police also learned from her friends that Terry had had a couple of run-ins with a rather suspicious man in the lead up to her disappearance. And this man sounded a lot like Christopher Wilder. One of them said that Terry had actually been approached on her university campus a few days prior to this by a man claiming to be a fashion photographer and asking her if she wanted to do a photo shoot with him. Terry declined the offer and nothing else came of it. The man didn't come and pester her, but obviously she told her friends that that happened because it was quite an interesting thing to happen in your day, I suppose. But yeah, that incident took place and then she never saw that man again. But then 2 days later, she disappeared. As soon as police heard this, of course, their minds went straight to Christopher Wilder. And it actually turned out that the police that were already looking into him had had a slight breakthrough. Actually, if anything, it was quite worrying for the case because police had found on Wilder's credit card, remember they were tracing his credit card everywhere he went, and it was found that he'd actually removed $19,000 from his account, completely clearing it out. So now this man is operating completely on a cash basis. He probably knew that he had to get rid of that credit card somehow because police could track it. This meant that he was going to be so much harder to track because they no longer had his location every day when he was purchasing different things. And this only told the police that Christopher Wilder knew that he was going to continue this spree. He wasn't going to stop anytime soon. The last time Terry Walden was seen, she was at that shopping mall, just like Linda Grober was, just like Teresa Ferguson was on the day that they went missing. It seemed that shopping malls were becoming Christopher Wilder's hunting ground, shall we say. And witnesses that were in the mall on that day recalled seeing Terry Walden walking around with a man that very much fit the description of Christopher Wilder. Same hair, same build, same height. Could he have been the man on her university campus? And could he have been coming back for her 2 days later? And like I said, her car that she drove to the shopping mall that day was gone. It was no longer in the car park. So it was theorised that maybe if she was a victim of Christopher Wilder's, maybe he'd abducted her in her own car. He'd stolen the car and now maybe he was on the run in that car. So immediately police put out an alert to every police force in that general area to look out for this car because if they found it, Christopher Wilder would be close by. But the only problem was they didn't know the license plate number of this car. There was no way for them to find it out either because her husband didn't know it. He didn't have any paperwork with it on. All they knew was what make and model and colour the car was. But without that very specific piece of information of the license plate, it was going to be very hard to track it down. Police tried. I mean, they were pulling over people that had this exact same make, model and colour of car all over like 5 different states. But unfortunately, it was just a way too big operation and they couldn't find it. They just could not find Terry's car anywhere. So in the meantime, police actually decided to search the surrounding areas of the mall, because if Christopher Wilder had taken off in Terry's car, where was his own? And sure enough, within a couple of miles of the shopping mall, they found Christopher Wilder's car. It was on some kind of isolated back street. It really looked like he'd tried to hide it. He didn't want it at the scene of the disappearance. So this practically confirmed to the police that Christopher Wilder was responsible for Terry Walden's disappearance, and now they needed to find him. They had a quick search of his car to see if they could find any clues as to where he was going, but they found that he'd completely emptied the car. All of his belongings were gone. And so it seemed as though he'd put them all in Terry's car and just switched vehicles, switched his getaway vehicle. Wilder's car was actually sent to a forensic lab so that they could test it for DNA and, you know, anything relating to all these missing women that they had right now. But of course, because this case took place in the 1980s and the car is quite a big thing to forensically search because forensics is so meticulous, it was going to take a long time to get those results back. So in the meantime, police continued on with this investigation. So this was on March 23rd. Terry Walden went missing on March 23rd in Texas. But that very same evening, police back in Florida received a phone call. It was from a utility repairman in the area, and he was phoning the police to say that he thinks he'd just found a body, and he believed it could have been one of Christopher Wilder's victims. So this man had been up on his ladder working on a telephone pole, so he's like in the middle of the air, when he looked down at the creek that was in front of him, and he noticed something floating in the water. So this body was recovered from the creek, it was taken to a morgue and identified as the body of the 3rd missing woman, Teresa Ferguson. Her autopsy revealed that Teresa had been beaten violently with a heavy blunt object. In fact, she was beaten so badly that her body was barely recognizable. I think they actually had to identify her body using dental records and things like that because visually she barely even looked human anymore. But though she'd been beaten so severely, her cause of death was actually found to be strangulation. So this must have been such a torturous ordeal for Teresa Ferguson. She was beaten, strangled, and then her body just thrown in this creek. So this woman had been seen in the company of a man that looked exactly like Christopher Wilder, and then a few days later, her body is found. She's been brutalized and murdered. Police knew they were on the right track now. But just 2 days after this discovery, after finding Teresa's body, another young woman would go missing. This time, it was 21-year-old Suzanne Logan from Oklahoma City, Kansas. Let me just put this into perspective for you halfway through. So now, women are missing from 4 different states. This started in the south of Florida, and then it moved up through Florida, several different points, all the way up north. Wilder then moved into Georgia when he kidnapped Linda Grober, and then from there he went to Texas, where he seemingly kidnapped Terry Walden, and now he's in Kansas, it seems. So he's travelling a very long time in between each victim. No, wait, sorry. Women are missing from 3 different states. He did go to Georgia. He did take Linda Grober to Georgia, but he didn't actually abduct anyone else from there. That was all he did. He just got that motel room and then left Georgia straight away. Anyway, back to the case. Now we have 21-year-old Suzanne Logan, who went missing from a shopping mall in Oklahoma City, Kansas. If this doesn't have Christopher Wilder written all over it, then I don't know what does. And Suzanne's family said that she would have probably been a very easy target for Christopher Wilder, because if he'd used that same MO on her, that he was a photographer and he could make her famous, he could make her a model, it would have worked, because that was Suzanne's dream. She wanted to be a famous model. This was a time when supermodels were like really becoming a thing. I think, was it like Twiggy that was really big in the 80s? I don't know. Women used to look at these magazines and be like, that is the dream. And Suzanne was one of those girls. If Christopher Wilder had used that ploy on her, she would have been swept up straight away. She would have voluntarily gone with the man. So now that is 6 women that are believed to have been abducted by Christopher Wilder, 4 of which are still missing after the discovery of Teresa's body. and it wouldn't be long until another one of those 4 missing women turned up dead. The body of Terry Walden, who disappeared from Texas, was later found in a canal not far from where she was last seen, and her autopsy revealed that her cause of death was from excessive stab wounds, which is interestingly a completely different cause of death to that of Teresa Waite Ferguson, and this is something that you don't see often in serial killers. Teresa Waite Ferguson was beaten and strangled. There was no knife involved, whereas with Terry Walden, that's all there was. She didn't seem to be beaten or strangled. I mean, she did have a couple of wounds that could potentially have been from where she'd been beaten, but she was beaten nowhere nearly as bad as Teresa. Usually, a serial killer will find a method of killing that they like, that they get the maximum amount of satisfaction from, and they will stick with that one. So it's interesting to see Christopher Wilder switching it up here. Terry Walden had been stabbed over 40 times, and most of those stab wounds were inflicted on her breasts, which shows an obvious sexual motive, although we knew that already, really. And then the very next day, another body was found. This time it was 21-year-old Suzanne Logan. She was found 270 miles away from where she disappeared, in a place called Junction City. She was found laying under a cedar tree. Her body was covered in stab wounds, and none of her belongings were anywhere nearby. Suzanne's autopsy showed that she'd been bitten on the breasts multiple times and had part of her body hair shaven by her attacker. The reason they thought it wasn't Suzanne that had shaved her own body hair was because it was just done really messily. It seemed like there was no rhyme or reason to anything. It was very patchy, some of the parts had bled, so it seemed whoever had done this wasn't used to doing it. And it was very unclear why part of her body hair had been shaved, like what her attacker got out of that. So now police were desperate to find Christopher Wilder. I mean, they were already, but after 2 more women turned up dead, they knew it was only a matter of time until more and more and more women would turn up dead. And that was when they received their next lead. On March 28th, police got a phone call to say that a stolen credit card had been used to check into a motel in Rifle in Colorado. Police get these kind of calls all the time. When a stolen credit card that has been reported stolen is used on a system, it flags up to like the cashier at that place. So the worker in the motel got a notification saying this card is stolen, please contact the police. So they did. But this wasn't just any credit card. This was a Visa card that police believed Christopher Wilder had stolen. I don't know how or why they thought that. They must have had intelligence somehow. They must have got a lead on this somehow. But they thought Christopher Wilder was using that card to get into this motel. They'd known for a while, actually, that he had this credit card, but they were just waiting for him to use it, because as soon as he used it, then they could locate him. So police, in the early hours of the morning, rushed straight down to that motel that Christopher Wilder had checked into. They found out what room he was in, and they surrounded it. Finally, they were about to get him. They were about to arrest him. This whole reign of terror was going to be over. But when they broke through the front door, Christopher Wilder wasn't in that motel room anymore. They were so close. They were so close. Christopher Wilder was in that motel room at some point that night, but it seemed that he'd already fled by the early hours of the morning. He hadn't even stayed there overnight. Police didn't know why, but something must have happened. Maybe he knew that the police were onto him, and maybe he knew that they were going to come and get him at that motel. Maybe he knew the card had flagged up on the system, and so he got out of there straight away. Or maybe he'd only checked into that motel for a few hours. Maybe the exact same thing had happened that happened with Linda Grober when he checked into a motel and then he had to flee the same night because she managed to outsmart him. But now he was back out into the world, and police believed that he was probably already looking for his next victim. And that very same day, he found her. Christopher Wilder struck again on March 29th in Grand Junction, Colorado. 18-year-old Cheryl Bonaventura was seen again at a local shopping mall walking out into the car park with a man that matched the description of Christopher Wilder. And in the days following this, police actually received a few different phone calls from people in loads of different locations, actually, claiming that they thought they'd seen Christopher Wilder and Cheryl Bonaventura together. Supposedly on the same day that Cheryl disappeared, her and Christopher Wilder were seen 100 miles away at a sandwich shop. And I mean, this was entirely likely because we know that Christopher Wilder, as soon as he commits a crime somewhere, he has to get as far away as he can. He travels like 100 miles at a time, so this is probably them. Police also got another call from a diner who claimed that Cheryl and Christopher had been there, and it was found that Cheryl had mentioned to one of the waitresses at this diner that she and her husband, Christopher Wilder, were heading to Las Vegas together. And the waitress said that Cheryl seemed okay. She seemed comfortable and happy. She didn't seem nervous, or she didn't seem like anything was off. And they were telling people that they were married. It was a wonder what was going on here. Maybe Christopher Wilder had forced Cheryl to lie about this. This abduction just seemed so different to the last. But then again, does anything ever look the same in this case? Other than the fact that he always picks his victims up from shopping malls and he's always a fashion photographer when he meets them, nothing else in this case is ever the same. His methods of killing are different. His methods of torture are different. He does different things with each victim. Sometimes he puts them in the boot. Sometimes he keeps them in the car. Sometimes he takes them to motels. Sometimes he puts them in a creek. It seemed that there was no method to Christopher Wilder's killings. It seemed there was a method in the beginning, but from there it was just whatever he felt like. Police were able to find records of Christopher Wilder and Cheryl Bonaventura staying in different hotels in Arizona and Colorado, but by the time they got these records, it was too late for them to go to those motels because they were no longer there. But those were the only few leads that police had in Cheryl's disappearance. A few very, very confusing leads. At that point, the trail went cold, and police just felt helpless. They knew that it was only a matter of time until Christopher Wilder murdered Cheryl Bonaventura and moved on to his next victim. So now police decided to try and prevent more victims from being taken by Christopher Wilder because they knew that they were struggling to capture him, so in the meantime, people could be protecting themselves. So police sent out alerts to every single shopping mall, pretty much in the whole of America. They told them to be on the lookout for Christopher Wilder, for the car that he was driving, because it seemed that shopping malls were his hunting grounds. And so if the staff and security and even people shopping there were aware of this, then they could be a bit more cautionary. But it was only 3 days later that Christopher Wilder would take his next abductee, this time from a shopping mall in Las Vegas. 17 magazine were throwing a cover model competition in the Meadows Mall in Las Vegas, Nevada on April 1st, and Christopher Wilder was in that crowd of young girls scouting out his next victim. He hung around in the shadows for a while, photographing all the girls on stage. And that was when he noticed one girl in particular. She was one of the models in this competition. Her name was Michelle Kaufman. She was 17 years old. Originally from Boulder City in Nevada, she lived about 30 miles away from where this competition was taking place, but she traveled all that way because it was Michelle Kaufman's dream to be a model. Her family had been hesitant to let her go all that way by herself, but she managed to persuade them, and they knew how much this meant to her. And so at 17 years old, she was allowed to make that journey alone. Some of the other contestants had seen Michelle Kaufman speaking with a much, much older man that day. They said the two of them were talking for a while, and then Michelle Kaufman went backstage, she got changed, and then she came back out and left with this man. So a lot of them thought he must have been her father or, a carer of some sort. But later that evening, when Michelle Kaufman didn't arrive home, her family reported her missing. And that was when all of her contestant friends realised what they'd seen that day. Immediately, the case was sent to the FBI because police just knew that she had to be another one of Christopher Wilder's victims, and that was very quickly confirmed. So FBI agents got in contact with 17 magazine and the mall and all of the contestants and requested a copy of every single photograph that was taken at the event that day so that they could analyse every single one. And that was when they struck gold. One particular photographer had been taking pictures of these girls on stage, and in the crowd, staring up at Michelle Kaufman, was Christopher Wilder. So this was enough for the FBI to confirm that Michelle Kaufman was officially the next victim of Christopher Wilder. And by now, they believed that she was probably already dead. Police started searches for Michelle regardless, but just 3 days later, another young girl's name would be added to the rapidly growing list of Christopher Wilder's victims. Wilder had made his way to a city called Torrance in California, and that was where he abducted 16-year-old Tina Marie Rasika. Tina was at her local mall that day in search of a job because she'd just turned 16 and she wanted some extra money. So she was going from shop to shop, asking if they had any vacancies, handing in her applications. It's believed that Wilder must have overheard this and then approached her, and of course we know what his usual MO is. He would have gone up to her and offered her the perfect job, to be a model. And with that, Tina Marie Rasika was gone. She vanished without a trace, and she was believed to be the next victim of Christopher Wilder's. Now, at this point in the investigation, if you remember, police found Christopher Wilder's car parked near the mall where he abducted Terry Walden from. They sent it for forensic testing, and finally those results came back a few days later. And it was found in the boot of this car, the trunk of this car, there were hairs and fibres belonging to Teresa Ferguson, one of the bodies that had been found. So she was officially a victim of Christopher Wilder. There was forensic proof of that. And this was huge for the investigation because although it was very clear what was going on, Christopher Wilder was abducting and murdering women, they had no concrete proof to link him to the murders just yet. Until this. So now if they caught him, they definitely had him. It wasn't like they were going to have to run around and try and find evidence. They had that evidence. They were just waiting to find him and arrest him. On April 4th, 1984, bear in mind, these abductions started in late February. So it's like 2.5 months that these have been going on for now. It's been a long time. On April 4th, the FBI made the nationwide announcement that Christopher Wilder was officially on their 10 most wanted fugitives list. They felt like making this announcement would be the best way to get this across to the whole of America that they should be on the lookout for this man and that he is a big danger, and that if they see him, to report him to the police. Less than a week later, police would receive their biggest break in the case so far. And this came in the form of a phone call from a truck driver in New York. This truck driver was called Charlie Lawson. He'd been driving down quite a quiet road one day. There were no other cars there. And that was when he noticed a young girl staggering along the side of the road. She was quite off in the distance, obviously, at first, and he couldn't really see much, but he already knew. Something inside him told him that this girl was in danger. And as he got closer, he realised that he was right. When he got a bit closer to her, he saw that this girl was in floods of tears. She had blood all over her. She was partly clothed. She was so distressed. So Charlie pulled over his truck. He got out and this girl came running over to him. She was in floods of tears saying, help me, I've been stabbed." And that was when Charlie noticed that this girl's chest was just covered and dripping with blood. She'd actually taken her own jeans off and tied them around her neck to try and stem the bleeding because she was bleeding so much. So Charlie got this girl in his truck, drove her straight to the nearest hospital for some treatment, and by doing so, Charlie Lawson actually saved this girl's life. Doctors performed life-saving surgeries on this girl, and had Charlie not been driving down the road that day, this girl would have probably lost her life. The girl was given some time after her surgeries to recover, of course, and she was going to make a full recovery. But police were so eager to speak with her because didn't this just look like the work of Christopher Wilder? So police went and spoke with her, and she told them that her name was Dawnette Wilt. She was 16 years old from Merrillville, Indiana, and she had been abducted by Christopher Wilder. And then she made the shocking revelation that Christopher Wilder wasn't acting alone. Dawnette told the police that inside his car with him was an accomplice, another teenage girl, and her name was Tina Marie Rasika. Dawnette told the police that Tina was absolutely brainwashed by Christopher Wilder. Whatever he told her to do, she would do. It didn't matter what it was, how dangerous it was, how awful it was, she would do it. Probably to save herself. And Dawnette told the police that it was actually Tina that had lured her away on the day that she too was abducted by Christopher Wilder from the South Lake Mall in Indiana. Tina was helping Christopher Wilder to lure in these girls, just like he'd done to her a week prior. Of course, a teenage girl could gain another teenage girl's trust a lot easier and a lot quicker than Christopher Wilder could, and he knew that. And he knew that this would be the most effective method going forward. So the two of them, Tina Marie Rasika and Christopher Wilder, had actually seen Dawnette in the mall that day, and they lured her out to the car with them. She trusted Tina. She thought that Tina was on her side. But when they arrived at the car, things very quickly switched. And that was when Dawnette Wilt realised that Christopher Wilder was a very, very dangerous man. But by now, it was too late. 16-year-old Tina drove the car as Christopher Wilder sat in the back with Dawnette Wilt and proceeded to beat and rape her for hours as they drove all the way to New York. In the middle of this whole ordeal, they'd actually stopped off at a motel for the night. Probably that motel that he used the stolen card at, but maybe something disturbed him and they got back in the car and left. But anyway, when they arrived in New York, Christopher Wilder, at this point he was driving, and he found a woods on the side of the road, and he felt that this would be the perfect place to take his new captive. So he pulled over and dragged Dawnette out of the car and into the woods. At first, he actually tried to suffocate her to death, but this was taking far too long for him. Instead, Wilder got out a knife, and as soon as Dawnette saw it, she was terrified. She pleaded with Christopher Wilder, please just don't stab me. You can shoot me, you can suffocate me, you can strangle me, you can do anything, just please don't stab me. But Wilder didn't care for her pleas, and he raised this knife and plunged it twice deep into her chest. Dawnette collapsed to the floor, and Wilder ran back to his car, leaving her for dead. But little did he know that Dawnette Wilt would survive his attack. Not only that, but she would also tell police everything about what was going on, including Christopher Wilder's future plans. And that was that he was heading to the Canadian border. But that same evening, Christopher Wilder would claim his next victim before he even left New York. Wilder, still with Tina Marie Rasika, stopped off at the Eastview Mall, and that was when he noticed 33-year-old Beth Dodge. Although it wasn't her that he was interested in, it was her car. Because Beth Dodge had this golden Pontiac Firebird, and Christopher Wilder needed a new getaway car. He'd been in the same one for too long now, it was getting too risky, and he knew that he was headed to the Canadian border. He wanted speed. He needed to get there as soon as he could. After that day, Beth Dodge and her car were never seen again, just like all those other girls. But in quite an interesting turn of events, one of those missing girls actually turned up alive the next day. It was 16-year-old Tina Marie Rasika, Wilder's new accomplice. She arrived back home in Los Angeles. Bear in mind, she'd literally just been in New York, which is the complete other side of the country. And people didn't believe her at first. She was telling people everything she'd been through, but no one believed it until she went and reported it to the police. She said that she'd met Christopher Wilder when she was at the mall looking for jobs, and he'd approached her saying that he had the perfect job for her. A modelling job, just as police had theorised. She said that he flattered her in all the right ways. He was complimenting her, saying that she looked like a natural, and then he sealed the deal with an $100 bill. He said, if you come with me and do a photo shoot today, you can have this $100 on the spot. And of course, Tina was sold. So Tina voluntarily followed Christopher Wilder to his car, and they drove away from the mall. And they enjoyed quite a nice, leisurely car ride together. They talked all the way to a local park where the photo shoot was gonna take place. Tina said when they got to the park, everything seemed so fine and normal. The photo shoot was happening, she was having fun, he was telling her she was a natural, she felt like she was doing a really good job as well. And then all of a sudden, Wilder pulled a gun on her. He pointed it right at her face and told her to get in the back of the car. And so she did. She didn't even make a noise. She just got straight in the back of the car. He got in the driver's seat and they drove away. She didn't know where they were heading. She didn't know what was going to happen. She didn't know this man's intentions. But they drove and drove and drove until they arrived in San Diego. And that was where Christopher Wilder pulled into another motel and bought a room for the night. And I'm sure you can imagine how this went. It went just the same as all the other motel stays he did with these girls. He snuck Tina inside this motel room where he beat and raped and tortured her all night. He tied her up with electrical cord just as he had with Linda Grober, but this time he was doing something a little bit different. He got out his knife and he was doing all these very shallow cuts and slashes all over Tina's skin, just enough to put her in pain and make her bleed, but not enough to kill her. He wanted her to be in pain. But then Wilder stopped very suddenly. He had the TV on the background, as he always did in these motels. He would always put the TV on full blast to drown out the sounds of him torturing these teenage girls. But he'd heard something on the TV that made him stop in his tracks, and he turned round and he saw the FBI announcement that he was one of the most wanted people in America at that time. Tina remembers this horrified look on his face, and as soon as the announcement stopped, he turned back round to her, untied her and said, "We've got to go now, get back in the car." It seemed he was just now realising how close the police were to getting him. And now the rest of the general public knew his name, they knew what he looked like, they knew that police were looking for him, and so anyone could trip him up at this point. So the two of them jumped in the car and they drove and drove and drove through multiple states. I don't think he knew where he was even going. He just wanted to get as far away from where he was as possible. And he decided that he was going to keep Tina with him. It seemed he liked her company too much to let her go. And Tina says that all the way through this drive, they were just talking. And it was very normal. I mean, at points he would get aggressive, but other than that, they would have normal conversations about their lives, and it seemed that he really liked her. Don't get it twisted, he wasn't nice to her. Just because he liked her didn't mean that he was nice to her. He still beat her, raped her, tortured her, just as he did all those other girls. But he would have these conversations with her and she would talk back. Of course, she was so scared that she was just compliant in everything. And so if he wanted to sit and talk for hours about his family or his job, then she was going to sit and talk to him and ask questions and be involved because she thought that was the best thing to do to save her life. But she could tell that he was forming an attachment to her almost, and he would go and buy her food and he would buy her favourite foods from gas stations when he was getting her something. It seemed he really cared about her, and it didn't seem he'd cared this much about the other girls. On April 10th, Christopher Wilder and Tina Marie Rasika ended up in Indiana, and that was when Christopher turned round to Tina and said, "Right, I'll take you home. I'll let you live on one condition. And that's if you help me find my next victim." And of course, this terrified 16-year-old girl was going to do anything it took to save her life. And so she agreed. And they set off to the nearest shopping mall. So the two of them went inside, and that was when Wilder spotted Dawnette Wilt, his next victim. He grabbed Tina's arm and pointed over at Dawnette, and Tina knew that was her cue. And so she approached Dawnette. She struck up a conversation with her and asked her what she was doing in the mall that day, and Dawnette told her that she was actually looking for jobs, just as Tina had been doing in the mall when she was abducted. And so Tina used this angle to lure her in, and she told Dawnette, "Oh, well, I'm a model, and my manager's actually here at the shopping mall if you want to speak to him. He's looking for other models to photograph. That could be a perfect job for you." So Dawnette seemed super excited about this, and so Tina took her over to Christopher Wilder. He introduced himself, told Dawnette all about his photography work. Dawnette seemed super excited about this. Tina was encouraging her, telling her how good it was to work for Christopher Wilder, and eventually Dawnette was won over. Wilder told Dawnette that all she had to do to become a model was come over to his car with him and sign some paperwork so that they could get started. And so she did. Dawnette voluntarily walked into this very quiet car park with him. But when they arrived at the car, of course, there was no paperwork. Christopher Wilder reached into the car, grabbed his gun, and pulled it on Dawnette. He told her to get into the car along with Tina, and then he sped out of this mall parking lot with his now two captives in his car. Well, in the car that he stole from one of his last victims. They drove for a while, probably out of the state again, for hours and hours, until Christopher Wilder eventually pulled into a motel and bought a room to torture his new victim in. Only he didn't keep that promise with Tina Marie Rasika. At least not fully, at least not yet. he dragged her into that motel room along with Dawnette. He wasn't done with either of them just yet. He forced Tina to stand in the corner of the room and watch him as he beat, raped, and tortured Dawnette Wilt, the girl that she'd helped to lure into this situation. If it wasn't for Tina, Dawnette wouldn't be there. And that's all Tina could think about as she was watching this. I think they actually stayed in this motel room for a couple of days, and the torture didn't slow down once. This was constant for Dawnette. And although it mainly was focused on Dawnette, Tina was still abused here and there. I think Christopher Wilder even drugged both the girls. He'd learned from his past experiences in motels by now, because these girls are of course going to try and escape, and so he drugged them with sleeping pills so that they wouldn't have the physical strength to be able to overpower him or run away. And just as he had done every other time, Wilder made sure that the TV was on in the room, with the volume all the way up so that it could drown out the screams and the cries of his victims. And on the second day in that motel room, the show that just so happened to be on the TV, because he didn't really pick a channel, he just put it on, put the volume all the way up, he wasn't watching it, but the show that just so happened to be on that TV was the news. And that was when a missing persons appeal aired for 16-year-old Tina Marie Rasika, the girl that was standing in that motel room at that second. Tina looked over at the TV and watched as her mother sobbed and begged on the TV for Tina to just come home, or whoever had Tina, please don't hurt her, just let her come home safely. Wilder turned round and watched the TV along with Tina, who was now sobbing back at her mother. This must have been the most heartbreaking thing. And in that moment, Wilder panicked once again. He decided that they had to get away from there. He told both the girls to get up and get dressed. They were headed to New York. But on their way there, Christopher Wilder decided that it was time to get rid of his hostages. He'd made that deal with Tina Marie Rasika that she was going to get to keep her life, but Dawnette Wilt wasn't going to be so lucky. And this was when Wilder pulled into that woods. He got out of the driver's seat, walked round to the side of the car where Dawnette was, he swung open the door and dragged her out. He grabbed her by the arms and started walking her into this woods, and then he stopped. And he turned back round and looked at Tina, who was still sat in the car. He told her not to move a muscle or he would kill her. And then he said he would be back in 10 minutes. Wilder then walked Dawnette Wilt into that woods, and Tina never saw her again. She sat there in the car for the next 10 minutes with the key in the ignition. If she wanted to go and sit in the driver's seat of that car and drive it away, she could have. And she could have driven to safety and saved herself. But at this point, she was so terrified and so mentally drained and exhausted that she just couldn't. She physically could not bring herself to get in the front seat of that car and drive away. So instead, she just waited there. Obediently, she just waited for Christopher Wilder to return, believing that he'd killed Dawnette Wilt in that woods. And he believed that too, actually, but of course we know that he didn't actually kill her. He stabbed Dawnette twice in the chest and then ran back to the car and drove him and Tina away. But as he did, there was something grating on his mind. He was very aware of the fact that he'd only stabbed Dawnette twice. And he was thinking, well, what if those 2 stab wounds are not enough? What if she's not going to lose enough blood? What if she's not actually going to die? What if she's going to survive this attack and then go and tell the police and give over my name and tell them my plans to go to Canada? He was panicking so much at this point, and he didn't want to take any chances at leaving a survivor. And so he pulled a big U-turn in the road and headed back down to that woods. He was going to go and finish the job. When he arrived there, he jumped out of the car, ran into the woods, and ran to the spot where he'd left Dawnette collapsed on the ground. But she wasn't there anymore. She'd already ran away. And now Wilder was stressed. As if this investigation wasn't close enough, he knew that police were getting closer and closer to him every day. They were hot on his heels. And now he'd left a survivor that knew his plans. And she was going to tell the police. So he ran and got back in the car, knowing that he needed to cross over that Canadian border today, before police had chance to speak with Dawnette. But first, he was going to have to get rid of his hostage in the car, Tina. But he actually had one last job for her before he would let her go. and that was that he needed a new getaway car. Obviously, when Dawnette recovers and talks to the police, she knew exactly what car Christopher Wilder drove, and so he needed a completely different car. He needed to be unrecognisable. He needed to steal one. Well, that was Tina's job. They went to one last shopping mall, Eastview Mall in New York, and that was when Christopher Wilder spotted 33-year-old Beth Dodge and her golden Pontiac Firebird. This time, he didn't bother with any of the theatrics. He didn't bother with any of the lies, any of the persuasion. He didn't bother pretending that he was a fashion photographer and that he wanted Beth as a model. No, he just walked straight up to her, pulled a gun on her, and told her to get inside her car. And she did. Beth was forced into the backseat of her own car while Christopher Wilder took the driver's seat and drove the golden Pontiac Firebird out of the shopping mall parking lot. And Tina Marie Rasika was ordered to drive the old car behind him. They drove for about half an hour out of the main hustle and bustle of New York. Of course, he wanted somewhere a little bit more quiet. Once they arrived in a secluded area, Wilder parked the car and Tina followed in quickly afterwards. He knew that he needed to get rid of Beth Dodge. He didn't want her. He didn't want anyone with him at this point in time. He didn't want hostages anymore. He just needed the car, and he needed to leave. So he grabbed Beth Dodge and dragged her out into the woods, and as he did, he shouted back to Tina to move all of his bags from the old car into the new car. And so Tina was working as quickly as she could, grabbing all these bags, grabbing everything he owned, when she heard 2 gunshots ring out from the woods. And she knew that Christopher Wilder had just murdered another girl. Shortly after, Wilder emerged from the woods without Beth Dodge. He had killed her, and he left her in a gravel pit in the middle of this forest. This was the first time in this whole case that Christopher Wilder had ever killed someone so quickly, and without all the extra stuff like beatings and rape and torture and lies. He was now just killing for convenience. He wanted a car, so he's gonna kill the person that owns the car and take it. This man was really acting like the world was just one big video game, and whatever he wanted, he could take it. And it didn't matter what he needed to do or who he needed to kill to get it. So now Wilder and Tina jumped in the golden Pontiac Firebird. They were gonna leave his old car there in this secluded area, and they started driving. And Tina remembers that Wilder's demeanour had changed since he'd gone and killed Beth Dodge. Now he seemed sad. This was the first time she'd ever seen any emotion in him, really, that wasn't anger. He started talking about how he was going to have to let Tina go now, and that he was going to have to go on without her, and that he didn't want her to see what was about to happen or where he was about to go. And he was genuinely upset that he had to leave this girl behind. Like I said, he seemed to really form an attachment to Tina Rasika. I don't know what it was about her that was different to the other girls, but he saw her half as a friend, of course never full as a friend. He never even saw women as human beings. But there was something there. He liked her too much to kill her. Wilder drove Tina to an airport in Boston. There, he got out a few $100s from his pocket and said, "Here, this is for a plane ticket. Go get yourself back to Los Angeles." So Tina took the money, said goodbye to Christopher Wilder, and then she ran into the airport and she got on that flight. She bought herself a plane ticket. She didn't say a word to anyone. All she was focused on was just getting home. Finally, when she touched down in LA and she realised that she was safe and her ordeal was over, she told the police. She told them everything. Tina was rushed to hospital and she was checked over, of course, because she'd been beaten and raped this whole time and she had a bunch of injuries. And as she was recovering in the hospital, police came and interviewed her about her whole ordeal. And that was when she told them everything about all his other victims, about his future plans, the fact that he was in a golden Pontiac Firebird heading for the Canadian border as she spoke. So the police and the FBI decided that now they were going to focus most of their search efforts for Christopher Wilder in those northeastern states, so like New York, Vermont, New Hampshire. They wanted as many people in those areas to be aware of what Christopher Wilder looked like, what he was doing, what car he was driving, and they printed out all these missing persons posters. They put appeals on every single news channel in that area, every radio station, everything. And then, on April 13th, 1984, Christopher Wilder was spotted. He'd made it all the way through New York into New Hampshire. He stopped off at a small gas station in the very quiet town of Colebrook. This town literally had a population of less than 2,000 people at the time, and it was only about 10 miles from the Canadian border. He stopped off to fill up his car, and as he did, he got chatting to the gas station attendant, and he was asking him what exactly was required to pass over into the Canadian border. You know, just how easy is it for you to get over there? And as he was having this conversation with the attendant, two state troopers named Leo Jellison and Wayne Fortier had spotted him and recognised him as Christopher Wilder. And when they looked to the side of him and they saw this golden Pontiac Firebird, they just knew that this had to be Christopher Wilder. Now was their chance to go and catch him and end all of this. So Leo Jellison got out of his car and started walking over to Christopher Wilder, and he just asked him if he could speak to him for a minute. And immediately, Wilder's face dropped. He knew exactly what the situation was. He knew his time was up. So Wilder turned to his car and reached down into the passenger side footwell to grab something. Immediately, Jellison knew exactly what Wilder was reaching for. It was a gun. So Jellison ran up behind him and grabbed him from behind, trying to wrestle him out of this car, but it was already too late. He'd already grabbed the gun. As both of these two men struggled to try to gain control of this gun, it slipped from Wilder's hand, and 2 rounds fired off. Officer Jellison stood up off of Christopher Wilder and staggered backwards. He had blood all over his chest. He was bleeding heavily. And then he looked over at Christopher Wilder, who had collapsed straight to the ground. It seemed that both of them must have been hit by these gunshots. Jellison was in a lot of pain, but he knew that he wasn't so badly wounded because he still had his physical strength. He was still standing, whereas Christopher Wilder had fallen straight to the floor. It seemed it must have been a lot more severe for him. The men watched for a second as Wilder laid still and silent on the ground, and then one of them went over and checked his pulse, and it was gone. Christopher Wilder was dead. It was actually both of the gunshots that had hit Christopher Wilder. One of them had entered his chest and then exited through his back, going into Officer Jellison's chest. So he wasn't hit by the immediate bullet. It had gone through something before him, so that was why he wasn't as injured as Wilder was. But it was that second shot that killed Christopher Wilder. It went straight into his chest and pierced his heart, killing him instantly. Christopher Wilder was declared officially dead at 2 p.m. on April 13th, 1984, at 39 years old. He was no longer a danger to society. A lot of people believe that Christopher Wilder intentionally shot himself that day, that this was a suicide. He knew in that moment that the jig was up and he killed himself. And it does seem likely. Obviously, I don't know the guy, but he does strike me as the type to take the coward's way out. He ran from police for as long as he could. All his life, even his teenage years and stuff, it was very clear that this man was a coward. He was never gonna own up for what he did and do jail time for it. But Christopher Wilder died along with the answers to a lot of police's big questions, like where half of his victims even were. It was believed by now that all of them that hadn't been found must be dead. There was no way that they could have survived and not have been heard from by now. But their bodies would be very, very hard for police to recover because now they didn't have Christopher Wilder telling them where to go. And it wasn't like they even had an area to search because this man had gone from state to state to state. I mean, these girls could be anywhere. On May 3rd, 1984, just short of a month after Christopher Wilder died, police found the next victim's body. This time it was 18-year-old Cheryl Bonaventura. She'd been shot and stabbed to death, and her body was thrown in the Kanab River in Utah, and it seemed she'd been there since March 30th. It had been over a month that this girl's body had just been floating in this river, and of course by now it was severely decomposed. A week after that, another body was located. This time it was 17-year-old Michelle Kaufman, the girl that had disappeared from that 17 magazine competition. Her body was found laying in a ditch, close by to a truck rest stop on a highway in Southern California. So he'd travelled quite a way with her from Las Vegas. But she actually remained unidentified for almost a month after that. So they found her body, but they didn't know it was Michelle for a very long time because, again, her body was so severely decomposed that they couldn't identify her. They actually had to use dental x-rays to be able to identify her body, which was eventually done in mid-June. She'd been beaten and raped, much like the other girls, and her body also had all of those cuts all over her. It seemed that Christopher Wilder had tortured her in the same way that he tortured Dawnette, with all these shallow cuts and stab wounds and slashes in her skin. She must have been in so much pain. So out of the 11 known victims in Christopher Wilder's crime spree, 6 of them were now confirmed dead, 3 of them had turned up alive, so that makes 9, but there were still 2 left that were unaccounted for. Rosario Gonzalez and Elizabeth Kenyon, the first 2 victims in this whole case. Still, to this day, neither of those women's bodies have been found. And so we don't actually know what happened to them. And for that reason, they can't actually fully be confirmed as Christopher Wilder's victims, although they are believed to be. Everyone that looks into this case believes it is Christopher Wilder. And speaking of believed victims of Christopher Wilder's, there's so many more cases, unsolved disappearances, unsolved murders, that people believe he is responsible for. But obviously without the evidence or identification or things like that, they just can't be confirmed. So I'm going to tell you about a few of those now. There are a lot of circumstantial pieces of evidence to say that he could be responsible for some of these. So let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think he's responsible for some of these cases that I'm about to talk about? So of course there was the Wanda Beach murders that we talked about earlier on in this case. And while they are still officially categorized as unsolved, most people believe that Christopher Wilder was responsible, me included, and that's why I included it in the middle of the video. The Wanda Beach murders happened in 1965, and believe it or not, there are still police officers and professionals working on that case to this day in 2021. And they actually believe that we might solve the case one day because they still have the girls' swimsuits. They still have them locked in an evidence locker. And they're just hopeful that as our forensic technology just gets better and better and better over time, then one day we will have the technology to be able to identify microscopic pieces of evidence on these swimsuits and potentially get a match to Christopher Wilder. They believe that within the next few decades, we will have answers for that case, and those girls' families, even though most of their families are gone now, it would be nice for them to have some answers. As for some of the other cases that some people believe Wilder is responsible for, there was the murder of a 15-year-old girl named Colleen Osborne. She went missing on March 15th, 1984. And to put that into the timeline of the crime spree, that's right between the disappearance of Elizabeth Kenyon and the murder of Teresa Ferguson, which, by the way, is confirmed to have been Christopher Wilder. So it just makes sense with the timeline. He was already in his murder spree at that point. So if there's even slight evidence to say that he did it, it's looking likely. Colleen was from Daytona Beach, Florida, which again, the area lines up with where he would have been at that time. And on March 15th, Colleen and her best friend decided to skip school to go to the local mall to watch a concert. And that day, Colleen disappeared. Colleen's mother tried to file a missing persons report for her daughter, obviously. However, the police in this case were horrid little monsters, and they didn't want to work over the weekend. So they told Colleen Osborne's mother to wait until Monday to file a missing persons report. This 15-year-old girl is missing. She's a child, and police just couldn't really be bothered working on the weekend. They even had the nerve to tell Colleen's mother that her daughter probably just wanted to run away. She was probably just being rebellious and that she'd come back in her own time. But Colleen was never seen alive again. Colleen Osborne's dead body was found a few weeks later, buried in a shallow grave over an hour away from where she lived in Orange County in Florida. But here's the thing, Colleen's body actually wasn't identified until 2011. Her case was an unsolved disappearance for years, for the rest of her parents' lives. They never knew what happened to their daughter. Meanwhile, her body was just sat in a morgue for years and years and years, unidentified. Her body was a Jane Doe, and people believe that Colleen Osborne was still out there somewhere for years. So the reason this murder is believed to have been down to Christopher Wilder was the timing. It was right in the middle of his murder spree. There's the location. This happened in Florida, and we know that he was in Florida at the time. He hung about in Florida for quite a while at the start of this case. And of course, there was the fact that she went missing from a shopping mall. And there's actually also a record of Christopher Wilder being in Daytona Beach on the day that Colleen went missing. If that's not enough proof, then I don't know what is. He checked out of a motel on the same day that she disappeared. So that leaves him just out and about in Daytona Beach, ready to abduct another girl. It's also believed that Christopher Wilder ended up heading in the general direction of where Colleen's body was later found. So that was his next point on the route. Because I believe he actually went back to his own house that day. You know, he completely fled his house after the disappearance of Beth Kenyon. But I think he went back that day to go and get all his briefcase and everything like that. He knew that he was about to be on the run for the rest of his life. He even went and put his dogs in a kennel. He had quite a few dogs, and he went and put them in a kennel because he knew he wasn't going to be coming back. So the next few unsolved murders and disappearances and stuff that people try to link to Christopher Wilder actually happened years before this murder spree that we just spoke about. So nothing fits in the timeline quite like Colleen Osborne, which is why I'm quite surprised that she's not officially one of his victims. So anyway, starting in 1979, an unidentified girl's body was found in a park in New York. This girl had been shot twice, once in the back and once in the forehead at very close range. This body took almost 40 years to identify. She remained a Jane Doe until 2015, when she was eventually identified as 16-year-old Tammy Alexander. And this is where the link to Christopher Wilder comes in, because even though Tammy's body was found in New York and Christopher Wilder lived in Florida, which is like the complete other end, like north and south, it turned out that Tammy was also from Florida. She disappeared from Florida in 1979. So it makes sense that maybe Christopher Wilder bumped into her there, abducted her, murdered her, and then decided to drive all the way up to New York to ditch her body there. Which this is a pattern that we have seen in Christopher Wilder through this whole case. He likes to get as far away from the crime scene as possible. He would pick girls up in one state and then take them to another one to abuse and rape and torture them, and then take them to another one to ditch their body. And another link here is that when Tammy Alexander was found, she was wearing some sort of men's race car jacket. And who do we know that drives race cars? Christopher Wilder. So the next case that could have been down to him happened just over a year later in January of 1981. 17-year-old Mary Opitz was last seen in a mall parking lot in Fort Myers, Florida. Mary's body has sadly never been found, and there's never been any more developments in that case. She literally just vanished into thin air. But there is one link to Christopher Wilder. Just a week later, there was another disappearance of another young girl from that exact same mall parking lot. This time, it was a young girl called Mary Hare, and Mary's body would be found 4 months later. By then, her body was very severely decomposed, but they could work out that Mary's cause of death had been some very deep stab wounds in her back. I don't know for what reason police think this, but Mary Hare's murder has been suspected to be the work of Christopher Wilder. And if that's true, then it seems that the disappearance that happened there a week prior was probably also him. Later that same year, police in Florida ended up digging up 2 lots of young women's skeletal remains. They were so decomposed at this point, and they were found just on some land in Florida. Of course, because they were skeletons at this point, identification was almost impossible. Luckily, they could identify one of the women, but the other one has sadly never been identified. But the one that was identified, it actually took them like 30 years to do it. She was finally identified in 2013. Her name was Tina Marie Beebe, and it seemed she'd actually had her fingers cut off as part of this ordeal that she must have gone through. These 2 murders of Tina and this other unidentified woman have never been solved. However, the link to Christopher Wilder here is that he actually owned some land in Florida very close to where these girls were found. The next case was 2 years after the last, in June of 1983, and that was when 20-year-old Shari Lynne Ball disappeared from Boca Raton, Florida. Her severely decomposed body was found 4 months later, and just like many of these other girls, it remained unidentified in a morgue for years. She was a Jane Doe. She was eventually identified in 2014. A lot of these have been very, very recent, of course, with developments in technology. And the links here between her and Christopher Wilder include just the general area, and it seemed as though it was the same MO that he used a lot of the time. And then in June of that same year, another girl went missing while on vacation in Florida. This time it was 25-year-old Nancy K. Brown. Her body was eventually found and identified a year later, and the link here is that she was on holiday very close to where Christopher Wilder lived. And the place where Nancy K. Brown's body was dumped actually later turned out to be the place where Teresa Waite Ferguson's body was found. And that was a confirmed victim of Christopher Wilder. So maybe he just used this field because he knew that it was a good place to hide a body, that no one's really going to find it for a while. And that's quite a strong link for me. I don't know about you, but I doubt there's a lot of people in Florida using the exact same field to dump a body. There was also an unidentified female body found floating in a canal in Broward County, Florida in February of 1984. So that is just before Christopher Wilder's big crime spree began. So it's entirely possible that it could have started a little bit earlier and that she could have actually been his first victim. This girl had been strangled to death, and her body had just been left in the water, as a lot of Christopher Wilder's victims had been. And of course the link is the MO and also the general area. It was in Florida. There is potential for Christopher Wilder. If half of these cases that I just spoke about were him, there's potential for him to be one of America's worst serial killers of all time. But sadly, I just don't know if we're ever going to get enough evidence to be able to confirm it for half of those unsolved cases that I just talked about. I don't know if we're ever going to get answers. But that is all I have for this case. Thank you so much for watching. If you watched all the way until the end, please let me know if you did, because I know this has been a big one. I really want to know what you thought of this series. I'm so proud of it, and I hope you guys enjoyed it just as much as I enjoyed researching it. Enjoyed is a bit of a weird word to use, but I am very passionate about my work. So just a quick reminder before I go that I am posting on my second channel again. There'll be a link to the channel down below in the description, as well as a link up in the eye here. I would love to have you over there. It's like one big party, and I can't wait to see your beautiful faces. A huge thank you to all of my channel members for supporting me and helping decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can click the link to do so in the description, or you can click the join button if you're on a desktop. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up down below. That would really help me out, and I would love to see your support on these 3 videos. I know I won't shut up about it, but it'd mean the world to me. If you want to subscribe, I post true crime content like this all the time. There's a link to do so right here. If you want to subscribe to my second channel, I've started posting on there again pretty much every week, and I'm so excited for what's going on there. And if you want to watch another true crime video, there'll be a playlist on screen right now. Bye bye!